So how does disagreement impact our mental health? Find out on this episode of IncreMental Health Tips. Welcome to IncreMental Health Tips. My name is Jared, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Liz. Today we're going to be talking about disagreement in our everyday lives and how disagreement can impact our mental health, both in perhaps some negative and some positive ways. So Liz, as a therapist, what would you say to people in your opinion? How would you distinguish, because disagreement is something that happens, but I think we can say reasonably that there's good and bad disagreement. So how do we tell the difference between healthy or useful disagreement and unhealthy disagreement that may negatively impact our mental health?
So I think some signs of unhealthy disagreement are things like name calling or physical violence, whether it's throwing a dish against the wall or physically putting your hands on someone to choke them or punch them. Those are really some clear warning signs that there's something that isn't right there. I'd say some other ones that could be indications of problems are when there's high emotions, if there's a lot of yelling, things like that, where it's better to go and see a therapist and talk it through in order to get a better sense of what's happening and what can be done about it.
Right. So there's obviously some physical elements to it, like you said, like perhaps violence, but there's certainly some emotional consequences as well. So in understanding this difference, I guess the first thing to dive into is what you're disagreeing on important, and how can you tell? So what I mean is, let's say you and I, because we've been married for a long time and we don't actually agree on everything. But if we're disagreeing on what we're going to do for dinner, that's a very different thing than if we disagree on something much more meaningful to us, like our expectations for the future or career planning or something like that. So how do we make that distinction as to what's important or not in less obvious cases where it's not so clear as to what's important or not?
Well, I think there's some situations where it's really an either-or situation, like, are we going to live in the city or the country? And if there's disagreement on those things, you really have to find a way to come to agreement, because if you're living together as a couple, you can only live in one place. So understanding, is different perspectives okay? Does it matter if we agree on this? What are the consequences of disagreeing? If we disagree on what we eat for dinner, then maybe one person's disappointed about what we end up eating for dinner, but it doesn't have a huge impact unless the way you're disagreeing about it is causing a higher sense of conflict.
Well, that touches on something that was talked a lot about in my graduate school program. I went to graduate school for industrial and organizational psychology, and we talked about disagreement in the workplace. And what was often emphasized was it's not actually the disagreement that's important, it's how you resolve the disagreement. So it's the process by which you resolve. So in the workplace, you actually want a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives to bring their ideas forward to solve a problem or whatever it is you're trying to do. But then ultimately, after these viewpoints are expressed freely, there needs to be a process by which a decision is made, if one has to be made, because that's the other part of it, is understanding when a resolution needs to happen or if it does. If you disagree on something politically or something religiously, there doesn't necessarily have to be a resolution in that moment to the disagreement. So understanding how it's going to be resolved is a really important consideration.
And a lot of times, if there is a big disagreement, it takes time to get to a resolution. There's some things you can decide in one conversation, but a lot of times it helps to take a break from a conversation. So if you find that you can't stay civil in the conversation because your emotions are getting triggered, then maybe even using a code word like volcano, like I'm about to explode, to communicate to your partner that you're not in a state of mind to continue the conversation. It can be really helpful. Just let them know, I can't do it right now. Let's take a break and get back to it later.
The other thing, too, can be to realign yourselves with a common goal. So if the goal of your disagreement is to make a decision, then sometimes, even if it appears obvious, reviewing the fact that you both want the same thing, you both want a good outcome, can really set a disposition or an attitude towards having a more productive conversation in the disagreement rather than an argument.
Yeah, I think starting with that shared goal, both parents want their children to behave, but they might have a different idea for how it can be approached. So recognizing we both have this shared common goal and staying focused on your goal, for your kids to behave or whatever the goal is, it can really help you stay more united even in your disagreement.
So another aspect of this is attitude. Recently, I was having a disagreement with a good friend of mine, and it was on, just whatever was happening, whatever tensions in our current social climate. You can take your pick with the way the year's been going. But the issue that we were discussing was not a personal issue for either of us. However, for whatever reason, there was some raw emotions there, and we weren't really far apart on our perspectives, but at the same time, we just had a very different way of thinking about it. And my friend was really uncomfortable with our disagreement on it, and ultimately had expressed to me that, we really shouldn't talk about things we disagree with, because I don't want our friendship to be impacted. And that really hit a chord with me, where I was like, that was quite a troubling thing to me, to think that a simple disagreement could impact a relationship. But the reality of it is, if you don't have the right attitude, it certainly can. And so after talking with this friend, the resolution we ended up coming to was that, I wasn't trying to change his mind. And he wasn't trying to change mine. This is not a debate where there's a winner or a loser. This is a discussion where we both just want to learn the other person's perspective and benefit from that perspective. And so sometimes checking your attitude about the disagreements, like, what is my goal here? Because if your goal is to try and win somebody over to your point of view, the best way to do that probably isn't going to be engaging them directly in disagreement, but rather showing them and helping them come to the realization that maybe your perspective is better than the way that they perceived it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times when we have that attitude of one person's right and the other one's wrong, that we can fail to see the fact that sometimes it's just differences in perspective. There doesn't have to be someone who's right, and just because someone thinks differently doesn't mean that you're wrong. So if we're approaching all our conversations with the idea of deciding who's right and who's wrong, then it can cause a lot more frustration than needs to be there.
Well, and also that point of view can really ignore a lot of nuance and a lot of the gray area that can arise in a lot of discussions. I mean, there are, of course, going to be benefits and drawbacks or trade-offs to every perspective to every side of a perspective of a disagreement. So disagreement is ultimately part of relationships, and we promised at the beginning that we would talk about how it relates to our mental health. And there's two parts of this, really. There's one, what you're disagreeing on, but ultimately the part of it that you can control is how you respond to the disagreement. So that comes along with discerning, is this important? What is my attitude? What are my expectations in this disagreement? And making those sorts of adjustments. But that's not an easy process. So, Liz, do you have any practical advice for our listeners who are trying to struggle with this and deal with the various disagreements in their lives?
Well, a lot of times people are trying to figure out better ways to disagree with their spouse so that they can resolve things more easily. And one thing that keeps people from coming to therapy is they think they need their spouse to come with them. And I know a couples therapist who half of his clients are couples and half of them are individuals who want to work on couples issues. So you can still make progress on a problem even if your spouse isn't fully buying into it. As well, I think a lot of times when we get irritated by something, it can cause us to feel angry. And I think sometimes, those small irritations, we can find a way to find some humor in it and learn to laugh at the irritations. I can think of in high school, there was one student who he would always call me by the wrong name for an entire year. And it was something I learned to laugh about instead of getting irritated by. And I actually had him sign my yearbook with the wrong name in it because I wanted to remember kind of this little joke we developed because he just couldn't remember my name.
Just along the same lines, I was in years ago, more than a decade ago. I was in a band as a drummer, and there were two other members of this band, and we all had some creative differences, and we would argue about the creative direction of what we were doing. But the joke that we had at the end is, but at least we agree that Paris is still the capital of France. So we would just agree with a random fact at the end to be like, okay, well, if we agree on that, then it doesn't matter, the tempo of the song or whatever it is we were arguing about at the time. So I think that that's all the time we have for today. But if you enjoy our content, please consider liking and subscribing. We really appreciate all the support. And remember also to share this with your friends. I mean, we develop this material and we take the time to do this because we really feel like it can help people especially now during these tumultuous times. So remember until next time that small steps can lead to big changes, and we'll see you next time.